Good Friday morning and welcome to another edition of the Debrief Podcast presented by FL1 News. It's your look at the headlines impacting the Finger Lakes. I'm joined today by Ted Baker of Finger Lakes Morning News. He's heard throughout the week on WGVA, WAUB, WFLR. Am I forgetting any others, Ted?
Well, primarily WGVA and WAUB, occasionally here and there otherwise, but that's the main ones.
Part of the Finger Lakes radio group. We have a lot to talk about in politics and in news, but winter is here fully.
Did you hear Kevin Williams this morning? We do an in-depth little chat at 6:38 in the morning. He said this weekend's storm will not be the biggest snowstorm of the winter, and the cold will not be the coldest cold of the winter.
That is scary stuff.
So
that is the worst.
This whole polar vortex thing, I think, is happening sometime later on this month or early next.
Oh, that is a depressing thought. So obviously January, that's when we start to hear all the good and exciting news out of Albany. And some people might be saying good and exciting. No, that's not it. So we had the State of the State address this week. It included all of the budget most of the budget proposals that we'll end up seeing and hearing about over the next couple. We talked about this a little bit this morning on your program. The big banner, the justice agenda. A lot of sort of flash around that. What was your reaction from how it was presented? Not just the substance. We're going to talk about the substance, obviously, but the presentation. This year feel a little different to you?
It's a little over the top. I mean, he's got his own graphics. I'm surprised someone didn't design an Andrew Cuomo logo to come up there and flash by. I mean, it's a lot about the governor, but then again, so is New York State government. We've talked about it on this program many times, how the executive has such tremendous power over the budget. And so I'm not that surprised. I was intrigued by your theory, which makes a lot of sense, which is that he may not see 2020 as his big opportunity for the White House. Gillibrand's already in. There are a lot of other people apparently lining up. So your theory has been that he's going to focus maybe on his legacy as governor and maybe won't run. And I can see that. There's a lot to that.
Yeah, and I guess the one sort of edit that I would throw on top of that would just be that I don't know. After I said it this morning, I was thinking to myself, well, this may not be his last term. He may run again. He isn't. I don't think he's that old. Mid-60s, I believe. I'm not sure of his age off the top of my head. But, I think that is pretty much the best working theory at this point because, it doesn't look like there's going to be any space for him on the Democratic side for 2020. I think the party is very interested in putting forward a woman. I think the party is very interested in putting forward someone who is very progressive. And I don't think, despite the fact that the governor has tried to make it seem as though he is a very progressive person or a very progressive politician, I think if not for being in New York State, he would be a much more central governor in terms of the policy he actually endorses and he actually puts forward. A lot of the framing around some of the legislation that we will end up talking about, or the proposed legislation, the framing around it is very interesting if you look at what his background is on it historically, and then you look at some of the things that he has said, right or wrong, over the last 2 to 3 weeks as he's gotten into this into the flow of this session. I guess the one question that I have before we do jump into some of the policy is, where do you think the tone is right now for Democrats having control of all of the necessary levers of power in New York State? Do you think the unity between Assembly Democrats and Senate Democrats and the governor is as clear as we might have thought? Because I've been kind of surprised over the last few days listening to some folks say, hey, it's almost like the two legislative chambers, the Democrats within those chambers, are basically shutting the governor out of the process and saying, these are the things we're doing. If you want to get on board, follow suit. But
there may be some of that. I think what we're seeing, you mentioned a moment ago, in Democratic politics in general, the youth movement is the future. Ocasio-Cortez is getting huge amounts of ink. She ran around the other day and did a Michael Moore-style where's Mitch thing, Mitch McConnell and the government shutdown. And so I think one of the things that you're seeing is the social issues that mean a lot to the younger and farthest left part of the Democratic Party are coming front and center, the way that the conservative, Tea Party issues did when the conservatives got control. So, I mean, I think that's what we're seeing is a recognition that we'd better start paying attention to some of the social issues that mean a lot to those people if we want their votes going forward.
In sort of hinging off of that, we don't have any federal topics, we'll call them, to talk about today. But what do you think the impact is, since New York plays a big role, and I made the assertion this morning that New York State kind of leads the way in terms of what the progressive agenda looks like at the federal level. Do we see any spillover into some of the policies now that we do start to see some folks saying, hey, I'm running for president. Do we start to see more specific policy steps now that we're in the year before the election, and also because of the power shift that happened in New York State?
I don't really think we will, because especially this far out, and even kind of in general, there's a tendency to really sort of stay away from policy. I mean, our politics and our elections have become much more about personality and about personal attacks and things, as we've lamented in our segments together. So I don't think anybody wants to get too far out there in terms of putting forth any specific policies that can be held against them later. So I think it's more about, hey, I'm running for president. If you're on the Democratic side, I mean, I think you have to run against Donald Trump. There are those experts that say, don't do that. You have to win back the heartland voters, the Rust Belt voters, appeal to their economic interests. And I think there'll be some of that. But I think largely, if you're going to be a Democrat running for president, you have to say, look at Donald Trump and look what he's done, and the investigations and the tweets and everything. And I think that's the thrust of where you run as a Democrat right now.
Yeah, so let's start to get into this, what some of the policies are that we're seeing pop up. First, banning single-use plastic bags. Some say it's the right thing to do. Others contend that it's overstepping, another anti-business move, yada, yada, yada. A lot of the same thing, the themes that we hear over and over again. What do you make of this one, and where do you sort of come down on it? Obviously, we touched on it a little bit this morning. I think both of us agree, get rid of the plastic bags. It's not that big a deal. But how do you see the reaction to this particular policy point?
Well, it seems like a lot of these policies, has anyone talked to retailers to see how it will affect them? I don't know. I mean, obviously, they've gone to plastic bags because they're cheap. So, what's the cost? Do we end up having it passed on to us? In general, I'm not a big fan of government compelling things. Maybe instead of banning plastic bags, we ought to just do more education and encourage people. And I mean, we're seeing it. More and more people bring their own cloth bags. You go into Wegmans and there's people with their cloth totes that they fill up. So they're obviously an environmental problem. I mean, all this stuff is. You ask any of these groups that go around and clean up along the ocean shore, and they get just tons and tons and tons of these straws and six-pack containers and all those kinds of things. So we have to address the issue, but it just seems like, and especially at the New York State level, it's very often, this is what we're doing. And you wonder, who was at the table? Mm-hmm. Who got to have any input on this?
Yeah, and I'm going back through and I'm trying to find that, because there was one story that had popped up in the last, so in looks like in the Rochester area, there were a couple stories about what that cost breakdown would look like for the private business, and it looks like the number was about 13 cents more, or 13 cents plus minus in some way, shape, or form per bag, I guess. Of course, the cost is going to be passed on to residents. And,
right.
This is the thing that everybody gets hung up on over and over again. But you know what I say to that? And, at this point, it's like, get in line. Every cost from top to bottom is passed down to the consumer, the taxpayer, the whatever. It's just because of the policies. And I actually really agree with what you're saying, which is, I would much rather see Wegmans do this. I would much rather see Topps do this. I'd rather see the individual players do it, rather than see the government say, this is what you have to do.
Well, and we've seen over time you can change hearts and minds, but it takes time. It's easier and faster to just pass a bill and say, boom, that's it, no more plastic bags, instead of educating people. I mean, the image we keep seeing and the one that keeps getting pointed to are all these bags in the trees. Well, they don't jump up there by themselves. So maybe what we need to ban is stupid people that can't keep a lid on their garbage. I mean...
Okay, so here's the number. It costs about 2 cents per plastic bag compared to about 10 cents for a paper bag. That's the breakdown. Yeah, I agree. I think you have to start with the behavior. And the more I'm sure you've seen it too. You go into grocery stores, even some department stores, and you see a lot more of those. I don't want to call them paper bags, but the actual sacks that we were talking about this morning. That's kind of the switch, and that is completely fine. I think so. Here's the way I sort of think about this. If the state is going to pass this cost onto the consumers and the businesses to institute a policy like this, they should at the same time open up an avenue where in some way, shape, or form the business or the consumer can be rewarded for the behavior that they're being forced to comply with.
Well, here's a perfect model, and that's the bottle bill. I mean, has anybody talked about a plastic bag deposit? I mean, we've changed behavior. Instead of banning plastic Pepsi and Coke and Mountain Dew bottles, we have a deposit on them, and it works. Most people save them up, and it's become a big fundraiser for charitable organizations and everything. Yeah. So maybe we need a plastic bag deposit instead, and you bring your plastic bag back and you get some money back or use it again. The other thing, it was funny when you were saying that. I was just thinking, I wonder if there's any possibility of a hemp bag manufacturing move here. I wonder if that's another use for hemp.
Well, and the one thing that I want to sort of push back on when it comes to the paper versus plastic debate, the single-use plastic. For anybody who says that plastic bags are just better, they're better, like they last longer, etc. How many times have you been in the grocery store and have had to have your things double or triple bagged,
right,
so that they don't fall apart before you get back to the car?
Yeah. The only real advantage is they're cheap and they have handles on them. I mean, you said this morning is just go to paper bags that have handles on them. My first real job was a bagger in a grocery store, and I can't imagine. The plastic ones are fast because you just cram everything in them.
Yeah. But
then you put it on your seat and it goes flat and the cans of cat food fall out and you find them under your passenger seat 3 months later.
Yeah, and that's I actually think that's the part that really is interesting to me, because the thing I'm like everybody else. I was a plastic bag guy for a very long time, and I don't turn the cashiers down when they're going through the bagging process. I don't make their life miserable like that. But the idea that a more sturdy bag, a more permanent solution, isn't a better one or a better idea is kind of crazy to me. It's like denying the opportunity to just make your life a little more convenient. I mean,
right. So obviously the driving factor is cost.
Yeah.
The retailers went to the cheap plastic bags because they're cheap, and they'd rather spend less to run their businesses, and you can't blame anybody for that.
Yeah, and the thing that I don't think has really been discussed too much on this front is what it can do, in my opinion, to the actual grocery business in general. So obviously, you and I have talked before on this program, on your program, everywhere, about the lack of grocery stores that we're seeing in rural places. And I think this is the kind of move that it hurts brick and mortar, but it also strengthens, the Instacarts, the Amazons, the places like that are going to be able to say, well, don't worry about a plastic or paper bag. Bring it to your door.
That's a real good point, because the grocery industry is on about the smallest margin. Their margin is tight. So, yeah, I could see where that might make a difference in somebody saying, do I want to expand my chain into New York? Not if my costs are going to be 0.5% higher and my margin's only 1 or 1.5% to begin with.
Well, and that would be the other. So following that logic, my question would be, what was the last major chain or brand on the grocery side of business to actually expand into New York that didn't already operate in New York?
Well, I don't know. I mean, at this point, there really is there even a national chain anymore other than Walmart? I mean, seems like most grocery businesses now are regional. You have Wegmans, upstate New York, and they've expanded around some. And then you've got, your Safeway or whatever in the Midwest or the South Central, Piggly Wiggly. I mean, it seems like it's become kind of those regional businesses, and then a lot of those, like Tops, are struggling.
Yeah, and to that end, I thought Wegmans, we'll post a link to it on the website on Finger Licks One. I absolutely loved Wegmans' response. A lot of the news organizations in Rochester tried to reach out to Wegmans to get their comment on this, and they basically said, we're not going to comment on it until it becomes rule of law. And I just found that to be the right response, instead of like you have a lot of the mom and pop operations crying foul because of the cost. Now, the flip side of it for Wegmans, they're probably saying to themselves, yeah, it's gonna cost us a little bit, but one, Wegmans has never been the cheapest as far as when you're going in and looking at their actual prices, and two, that I would assume they have the cushion and the ability to move towards something like this because, and this is just a guess, they probably saw this coming a long time ago.
And not only that, but a big part of their appeal is that they are forward-thinking and environmentally friendly. So they will probably find a way to turn that into an advantage and say, for that matter, they could jump out ahead before it even becomes a law and say, you know what, we're going to be responsible and we're going to ban these now.
So let's switch gears a little bit. Another state proposal. Raising the age to purchase tobacco to 21 years old. My opinion kind of seems like a no-brainer. But in contrast with some of the other legislation that's being put forward, there are some questions around it. What do you feel that will actually accomplish? Because it's not preventing people who are 18 or 19 years old from consuming or using. It's just stopping them from going to the grocery store to buy it. Is this imposing the state's will on businesses, or is this just kind of the health community? I think it's more tied to the health community and their reaction to what is now decades of data that shows that there's nothing good that comes out of smoking cigarettes.
It's all of those things, and my thought on this has not changed in decades, which is that we need to decide when someone's an adult and grant them the full privileges and responsibilities of adulthood at that age. It's the age-old argument, but if you can be drafted into the military, if we had a draft, at 18, then I don't see how you can be told you can't smoke a cigarette. I mean, let's decide when someone's an adult and let them make that decision. Because, yes, there are all kinds of harms from smoking, but people have put substances into their body to feel differently since the beginning of time, and they always will.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of like, this is just my opinion, but if we were raising kids to be responsible adults across the board, or at least at a higher percentage than we are right now, without the coddling, without the babying, without sort of the imposed structure that, where you have 6-year-olds who have a busier schedule than you or I because of all the sports they're playing, the activities, everything else like that. I think we wouldn't have to be in this scenario where we're jockeying ages all the time or pushing them forward or pushing the bar forward, because I think moving the age of anything, increasing that age, is a reflection of how well or how poorly you're actually raising that subsequent generation of kids.
Well, and I think this argument kind of dovetails with the other one about the plastic bags because, again, we've had education and we've had kind of social pressure, and as a result, smoking's way down. I mean, I'm older than you are, so I remember when I was a young kid when it was pretty common. I mean, everybody smoked. People smoked on TV. People smoked in the movies. And now it isn't very much anymore. And my own workplace, there's a handful of people that smoke, and they're shamed out to a place out back. They have to go outside when it's 10 degrees and snowing to smoke a cigarette. So maybe we just continue with that. Again, rather than imposing government. That's the shortcut way to impose government will on people, rather than continuing the effort, which has been a success over the decades. I mean, you're never going to eliminate smoking unless you do it through government means. But you can reduce it, and you can teach people that it isn't a very good idea, and that effort's working. It's slowly, but it is working.
Yeah, so, and then the piggybacking off of that, we have the move to legalize the sale of marijuana. The governor called it a move to stay competitive, which I thought was a really interesting choice of words. Adoption for municipalities will be optional, apparently. That's how they're going to work it.
There was already a story the other day. I think it was a Long Island community that already has gone on record. I don't know if they did it or said they would, but they would essentially overrule the state and say, not in our town.
And it's interesting because I think you'll end up you'll have that happen in counties or communities where law enforcement the ranking law enforcement folks are vehemently opposed to it. And so my concern with that is that it becomes an economic deterrent on top of it just being a deterrent, a crime deterrent as a crime you're allowing it to impact other things instead of dealing with the problem. It's sort of like when we went, if you want to roll the hands of time back 3 or 4 years, when folks were debating about whether there should be a casino in Tyre. The folks who were saying, well, it will increase crime too much, instead of planning for or being part of the planning process, which was carried out by law enforcement locally, instead of being part of that process, it was just, well, it's going to impact this, so we cannot do this, and that thereby affects the economics of the situation. And that is just, to me, that's a nightmare, because I think you also have the debate that's sort of ongoing right now, where that money is going to go when those taxes are collected ultimately. It's going to go mostly to schools and school districts that have been most impacted by the laws around marijuana now and going back. So it's not going to positively affect the rural communities that have been impacted by every other policy that Albany has set forth. But they won't even have some of them aren't even going to have the opportunity to chip into what will be, some amount of money that will be coming back.
Well, and our drug laws are insane. I mean, it breeds disrespect for the law. You have alcohol, by far the most dangerous drug, the biggest social cost, again, by far, but it's legal and taxed and regulated. Then you have pot, which isn't. So it doesn't make any sense. We have, I don't know what the percentage is, but a large percentage of our jail population across the United States is nonviolent recreational drug users that we have to pay to house and feed and transport to court. Let them all go. And just, again, people are going to put substances into their bodies to get a nicotine high or a pot high or an alcohol high. They're going to do it.
Yeah, and it's just, I think, again, it's the means to how you get there. And, I really don't like the governor's stance on this, because I think historically he's been pretty anti-marijuana legalization. And now he's introducing the policy and making it a big part of his message, but then he's sort of backpacking it with, well, but municipalities can back out. Oh, and by the way, yeah, we just had to do this because
right.
If they can't do it here, if they can't operate that business here, they're going to go someplace else and they're going to operate that business. Well, that's true pretty much with every industry that exists.
Yeah, and it doesn't.
Hello.
I don't really understand why this issue has become so big and so central. I mean, like I said, I'm in favor of sensible drug laws, but making marijuana legal, if I'm governor, is probably not in my top 20 of things that I need to do to make New York a better state.
Yeah, and there again, of course, you're seeing from a lot of the Unshackle Upstate or different organizations that advocate for upstate and business friendly, and unfortunately it tends to skew Republican, and it becomes very partisan, this sort of divide. And, there isn't enough discussion in what we've seen of the agenda for 2019 around how we're going to continue supporting all of the policies that we're putting forward while still growing the economy, while still, fostering development, especially in the Finger Lakes region, where if you stifle growth for even 6 months, it could be devastating to the economy for decades, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, we have different needs in upstate New York than downstate New York does, and we do need some regulatory relief. I mean, I had this conversation with Assemblyman Kolb a long time ago when I think it was the Generations Bank that went in down on 414, and they had to go through just a tremendous amount of red tape and grief to get a curb cut for their driveway. And, these kinds of things just add up for businesses. And going back to the agenda, that's the other part of this, is that this address comes out every year and has all these big sweeping ideas, and there's just never a lot behind it. It's like a big cotton candy of a budget, and when you take a bite, it's all air. There's nothing there. How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to do it? Let's rebuild our infrastructure, but nobody wants taxes. Okay, so where's the money come from? I mean, it's great to dream, and it's great. John F. Kennedy said, "Let's go to the moon," and nobody really knew how. But I think we need a little more nuts and bolts discussion of, okay, how are we going to accomplish these things? And can we accomplish them? Are they realistic goals? The governor said, I believe the figure was something like $150 billion to spend on infrastructure, and the entire state budget was like $178. So, okay, where's that pot of money coming from?
So, let's piggyback off of that as well. The new Democratic leader of the state Senate, she said that she wants to create a permanent cap on local property tax increases, the tax cap that we've all heard about, that we hear about every single year. We hear all the boards of supervisors and the legislatures and the town boards, the village boards, they all talk about it. It's that percentage that they cannot exceed. It restricts how much it can increase in one single year without a special vote from either the board or the people who are represented within it. So at the same time, we're also seeing the future of AIM funding. We talked about that this morning on your show, which helps the local small communities. And then you also have the backdrop of the Shared Services Initiative, which appears is going to continue. Is the deck just being stacked too high? And I wanted to bring this up while you mentioned that, because it's like at some point to correct water infrastructure, to make sure that our roads and bridges are safe and workable for the economy that should be growing up here. It's going to require one of those things to fail. Whether it's the tax cap, whether it's the money that's coming in from the state, it'll have to be dramatically increased, which would mean a dramatic increase in state taxes. What is it? Like, something has to give, right? Like, at some point.
Well, I'm in principle opposed to the tax cap, just because why is it Albany's prerogative to tell me in Rushville that I can't fund my schools better if I want to? If we, the residents of whatever little town, get together and say, we want a really good school and we're willing to pay for it, who is Albany to tell us that we can't, number one? Number two, going back to what I was talking about earlier about disrespect for the law, what's the first thing that every single municipality does every year? They pass an override. Mm-hmm. So the thing doesn't work anyway. I mean, most people don't use the override. And then the third point is, it's 2%, but it's not really, because this counts and that doesn't count, and this might count on a Thursday. It's a mess.
Yeah, and I think the thing so a couple points there. One, I'm all for a vote to justify whatever the spending increase is, no matter what it is. If it's something significant, if, a village or a town or a county decides, well, maybe we want to try and fund schools at a higher percentage, right, and it requires a 3 or 4% increase in the levy. I'm fine with there being a vote, a community sort of referendum.
Right, because we get to vote. We get to vote on our school budget every year. So
and at that point, the residents have spoken. The residents are acting on their own accord. But the flip side of it is we're talking about what the state is doing, and it seems really ironic to listen to the state say, well, you can't raise your taxes by this much, but by the way, we're going to increase spending tenfold over the course of 3 years, and you're going to have to pay for it one way or another. Medicaid, Seneca County making these ridiculous, and every county is the same, making these ridiculous $112,000, $113,000 payments to the state weekly to compensate for a program that isn't covered by the state because the state just chooses not to, or chooses to pass the cost down to the county. It is mind-boggling how that is, the hypocrisy of it all. It just doesn't line up. It doesn't jive.
Well, and I talked about this on the show this morning after I got off on the segment with you, which is that we talk about federal money and state money and local money. It's all our money. So the only reason that we need state aid in the first place is because the state takes the money away from us and then gives back some of it if we're nice. How about they don't take it in the first place and let... My theory of government has always been that our government is completely backwards. The federal government is the biggest and most powerful, then the state, then the local, and we'd be way better served if it were the other way around. And I think that's what the founders really intended. They intended local people to do most of their governing. Mm-hmm. We still control our schools at the local level, at least to begin with. Then the state government does only those few things that we're not able to do on our own, and the federal government does only those very few things that neither the local nor the state governments can do. So there, for everyone who thinks I'm a big liberal, I've just shown you that I'm actually a small government conservative at heart.
And I've talked to, I've had conversations with local Republicans, local Democrats, people who on the surface appear to be very far left and very far right, who have told me over and over again that the difference in rural upstate, the difference between a Republican and a Democrat, a conservative and a liberal, the margin is very slim between the two. There is not the divide that you might see in other, maybe in a more urban setting or in the Midwest or maybe in the Deep South. That divide is not as wide as people think it is. And that's one of the things that I think people need to realize when they're looking at how their local government is functioning. Forget about what you're seeing at the federal level from the White House or from Congress or from Senate. It is a completely different ballgame. And oftentimes the margin between your furthest left town councilor and your furthest right town councilor the margin is pretty damn small.
Yeah, and I think that's because, you have to look each other in the eye when you stand in the line at the bank, and you've got this tremendous job to do. I think it's pretty amazing when you think about that some of our town boards, we have these part-time people who don't have any great expertise in government, and yet they're expected to make multi-million-dollar decisions about water plants or about this project or that project. And I think overall, most of us would agree they do a pretty darn good job of it.
So here's the sort of last point that I'll make about the tax cap and the AIM funding. Shared Services Initiative tied a great deal to compliance and subsequent funding. So comply or the funding will be taken away. Now we're seeing that, and this was aimed at small rural communities that had opportunities, or according to the governor, had additional opportunities to share services, despite the fact that they already were. So basically it was, if you don't create this committee, you will be punished by not receiving or not being fully eligible for X, Y, and Z refunds from the state as those projects play out. Now we find out that the governor's latest proposal is to take some of that money away anyway. So congratulations, all these small villages and towns and counties that have decided that they want to work together more with one another to save money. The governor's going to take it away from you anyway.
Well, and that's, if you've seen the Bob Lonsberry theory, the Rochester columnist and radio host, his theory is that this is direct punishment administered by the governor against the part of New York that didn't vote for him. And that's why Buffalo is getting the $1 billion, and Syracuse. That's why all of this supposed Finger Lakes economic development, so much of it goes to Rochester. Yep. I don't know if I buy that theory. It's plausible. It just seems pretty extreme to be that blatant about it. But that's I think he's not the only one who believes that's if you play ball with the governor, you get rewarded. If you don't, you get punished.
My thought process is like, at what point, and to me, I think it says a lot about New York State and how it operates that is even a possibility. And I think that says a lot about state politics. And I think that says a lot for all of the good that's going to be talked about. And I know the next time Jackie Augustine's on the pod, we're going to be talking about the LLC loophole and how, there's finally some focus on closing it, and that's great. But with all of the other policies that we're seeing be put forward, and how dramatically they will impact the Finger Lakes, and with how dramatically they will impact the way Upstate does business, functionality of some of our villages may actually be completely neutered. I mean, I don't know how some small villages, the argument that, well, the AIM funding, it was only taken away from communities that it accounted for less than 1% of the total budget.
True.
That's one thing. But next year it's going to be something else. The year after that it's going to be something else. God only knows what programs, these rural communities aren't going to get funded for this year that they had been in the past.
And that's why I think maybe it's less punishment on the part of the governor than it is making more and more people reliant upon him. The more you squeeze the villages and towns, where do they have to look? To the state. And who decides who gets what goodies from the state? The governor.
Yeah, so obviously there are so many other things at the state level that we'll be talking about over the next month to 2 months before the budget becomes sort of finalized in early April. But the last one that I wanted to touch on was early voting. Obviously, the timeline for voting has been turned on its head. Petitions are going to start circulating in February now. They'll be due by the beginning of April. Primaries will be held at the end of June. And we may not even see the sun before then. So it's like, folks were used to passing petitions when the weather was a little more favorable. I think a lot of people are in favor of the prospect of introducing early voting, but to turn the timeline like this, what that process looks like, that's tough to me. That seems like it's tough.
Yeah, we were talking about this morning as well. I don't know that I'm necessarily a proponent of early voting. I think we need to make voting easier. I think it's a national shame when we have people being elected by 40% of 40% of the people who turn out. I mean, that's 16% choosing a president or a congressman. So, other countries have done things like make voting day a holiday. There's obviously pushback to that from businesses because they say, we have to give our workers another day off. But if you're working from 9 to 5 and you get out and you got to rush home and get the kids off to soccer practice and get supper, and then you got to rush out and get to the polls before they close, and in rural parts of upstate, not everybody's got great transportation to get to the polls. So again, it seems like another one of these ideas that was sort of just put forth without any real discussion or thought. Show me the work, as they used to say in school. Where did somebody decide that early voting is the thing and that it should be 10 days early? And, I think there are other ways of doing it. I think we talked in one of our podcasts that we did here that in this age of technology, obviously there's security concerns, but there's got to be a workable way. I can click and order something from China in a minute from now and have it on its way and get it in a couple of days, but I can't go on my computer and click and vote.
Yeah, so, I think it's interesting because there's a lot of talk about sort of the secure when these proposals, when we're over the last 2 weeks, when press releases are coming in and you're accumulating all this information, you're pushing it to Facebook and the reaction to it. I kind of gauge how people feel about it based on that. And I was amazed at how much of the reaction, probably like 80 to 90% of it, was sheerly themed around the things that we see discussed at the national level. So, this is a move to allow illegals to vote in our elections and yada, yada, yada. And take a deep breath. If that's what you're thinking, take a deep breath right now.
Well,
and right after that, call your Republican election commissioner in whatever rural county that you're coming from and ask them about security of local elections and ask them about the integrity of those elections. We have been doing this for 4 years. In my time, I've been doing this here at Finger Lakes One for 4 years. I have covered 4 to 5 full election cycles, and I have never once heard a local election commissioner on either side of the political aisle say integrity of the process is a concern, or it was challenged, or we had a rash of fake votes, or whatever the case may be. That just does not happen at the local level. So that is not where the discussion should be.
Right.
This could potentially cost local municipalities more, counties more, as those boards of election have to change the way things are done, although I think there might be some savings in having all of the primaries at one time. But, I also have piggybacked off of that, and the Republican notion that absentee ballots are the answer, I think, is insane. There is no reason why we should be relying on a mail-in system that has always existed and has been marketed so poorly that no one, for all practical purposes, other than older folks who can't get out to vote or people who I guess are going on vacation, have opted to use. Anyone, for the last probably 10 years, anybody could get away with using an absentee ballot, even using the old framework of you have to have a legitimate reason, because nobody was actually checking to see what the reasons were. So if we're going to talk about voter integrity, to me, that's a lapse of voter integrity. And hello, you have another problem on your hands. Opening it up 10 or 14 days before election day so people can go vote, I don't think it's going to have a dramatic impact on how many people actually turn out to vote.
Well, I think again, we have to ask ourselves, when people don't vote, how many cases is it because they really wanted to and couldn't make it work, and how many cases was they were apathetic and didn't give a damn and weren't going to vote anyway? I mean,
and that's the issue.
And it's become a partisan issue because there are more registered Democrats in the country than there are registered Republicans. Republicans tend to do better in turnout. So if more people find it easier to vote, that will likely benefit Democrats. And that's why, in my opinion, a lot of Republicans have been opposed to voter reform, because as long as their turnout's better, they can win more elections.
So I agree, but I would just throw in the caveat that I think the party that has control over any given district, you can look at the 23rd district as an example. It's heavily Republican. It favors Republicans because of the rural, which is controlled by largely the Seneca County Board of Supervisors has a total of 1 Democrat on the board now, with a registration change that's in the works. The parties that have control over their respective districts have control because they appeal to the majority. Now, that said, if there isn't any effort to outreach to the other side, or God forbid, just the people who are kind of floating in the middle of no man's land, you aren't going to see any improvement. I think there is a legitimate ceiling to how much more the Democrats can gain in the places where they already have control, like Rochester, like Syracuse, like Buffalo, like New York City. Even if you introduce the prospect of early voting and potential integrity issues where you have more folks coming out for a particular party, I think there's a limit to that. I think first and foremost, you do have to get over that empathy. You have to find a way to make people actually care about what their elected officials are doing.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it's interesting because that's been one of the arguments made is that it doesn't really do the Democrats any good if 10% more people in California come out and vote. They've already got California. They've already got New York. It's that outreach. And that goes back to our overarching theme that we've been going through for months here, which is the partisan divide. I mean, it's gotten harder for either party to try to talk to people in the other and come up with any central basis on things we agree on. There isn't very much left that left and right can say, yup, we agree on this.
I was saving this to talk about this at another episode, but you would be shocked, and maybe not. Maybe you've been hearing it too. The number of people who have said to me, I voted for Donald Trump. I really thought that he was going to be change. And thus far, I just haven't seen enough change. And some of them have even said, I'm not voting again.
There have been some studies I've seen lately that say that might be the case. And of course, this government shutdown, some of those 800,000 people out of work were Donald Trump voters. And they're sitting there saying to themselves, he said he was for me, but it looks like he wants a wall more than he wants me to be back to work. So that'll remain to be seen whether his support erodes to the point that he can't get reelected. I think I would have said, if you'd asked me a few months ago, that his chances of reelection in 2020 were very high. I still think they're pretty good, but I think they're becoming a little bit less for some of those reasons you're talking about.
So I think one of the issues here is that whoever the president is, and it doesn't matter what party you're talking about, the speed at which life changes on the ground, especially when you introduce a state like New York, where policies are being introduced in a certain way. And I think this is even true in places where, the state government isn't as pushed one way or another. I think the speed at which the economy changes, the speed at which people see more jobs, they see the economic development, they see the different things that are indicators, the kitchen table issues that we kept hearing about this last cycle, the speed at which we see change on those fronts makes it very, very difficult for any president to really be successful in just 4 years. Because I think you have to look at, if you're trying to find definitive change in the economy, I think you have to look on the bigger scale. And I think for most of the things that people are worried about, jobs, wages, things like that, I think you have to look in terms of decades and not in terms of one presidency to the next, 4 years to the next 4 years.
I think that's a very good point. And I also think that a lot of these big kitchen table issues, I don't know that they're necessarily problems that can be solved through the political process. I mean, it's easy for one side to blame the other side for all the manufacturing jobs disappearing, but that was going to happen no matter who was president. Robotics and outsourcing to other countries. I mean, when I was a kid in the 60s, you couldn't make something in China and ship it over to the United States and make that work. Well, now you can. Now there are robots on the auto production lines that can turn out cars with 3 guys on the line where they used to need 100. I mean, that's not the Democrats' fault. That's not the Republicans' fault. That's the world changing around us. So I think you just brought up a really great point, which is our political process is sort of centered around very short-term pieces of time when the problems we're dealing with are much bigger problems. And that's a real good point that needs to be expanded on, I think, in the future, is that the way, we're set up in these 4-year chunks dealing with problems that have developed over 40 or 50 years.
So, yeah, my thing with that is, like, are we going to, because you can marry this to the changes we've seen in in stores, in fast food chains, the ordering kiosks,
sure,
the self-checkout aisles. Are we going to compare this to the mass exodus of manufacturing in 20 years when, in 2030, there aren't any physical employees other than cooks and runners at restaurants or at at fast food restaurants, or if there's only one cashier working at a time at Walmart or at Tops or whatever the store may be?
I think this is going to be the central economic issue of our times over the next 20, 30, whatever years. I think I said this to you once before. We're going to reach a point where there aren't enough jobs for all the people in the country, and then what are we going to do? Because there is such a built-in opposition to the idea of paying somebody who doesn't work. But I think we're going to reach a point where we don't have a choice. There's going to be, in a few years, 400 million Americans and 100 million jobs. What are we going to do?
Yeah. And links to all the stories that we've been talking about are embedded within the story on Finger Lakes One, and they'll be in the YouTube description if you're watching us on YouTube. So the last story we're going to talk about today, obviously, the firing of Jeremy Capel. He was a meteorologist with WHEC-TV in Rochester, uttered a racial slur during a live broadcast. Took a few days for them to get around to it, but now we're seeing, after all of the reaction, and I don't want to go back into, if you're curious about how we got here with that whole thing, go back through and read some of the great reporting that's been done on that issue. Now we're seeing a similar situation play out in St. Louis, with the caveat of the meteorologist wasn't fired. The broadcaster was not fired. Your reaction to that, and I guess also, since you and I haven't talked about it, reaction to the situation as a whole as it played out.
Well, I've been in broadcasting over 40 years. I'm a sports broadcaster, which involves going on the air for 2 hours with no script and speaking off the cuff about what I see. So I'm very cognizant that you can have a slip of the tongue. The difference is the St. Louis station management looked at their guy and said there's no indication in his background that he's a racist. We have no reason to believe that this was anything other than an innocent slip of the tongue with no ill intent, so we're going to allow him to apologize and move on. I think the station management handled it much better in St. Louis than they did in Rochester.
And to me, I think that's where it sort of comes in. And the perception, and I know there's some conflicting data, at least in my opinion, there's some conflicting reports about whether the station decided after Mayor Warren said that he should be fired, or whether it happened before or after.
Well, I was just going to say, here's a comparison, which is the infamous Rush Limbaugh comments on Monday Night Football several years ago about Donovan McNabb. In real time, no one took exception to that, including 2 black people on that panel with Limbaugh. Neither one of them at the time, in real time, were offended. It was when activists got involved and made it an issue that it became an issue. And I think that's what happened here with Channel 10. I think it's an unfortunate slip. It's a terrible word. It's a word that carries serious injury to black people. And if there's an opportunity here to have some discussions and increase some understanding, that would be great. But I think it was a case of nobody thought anything of it until people whose job it is to point to these things and make hay out of it did exactly that.
Yeah, and there are tons of elements at play here. Obviously, social media, if not for social media, this wouldn't have even become a talking point. Obviously, it was picked up by national broadcasts, Today, Forbes, you name it, the CNN, Fox News, everyone was in the ring on this one. But a couple of things that sort of, and I talked a little bit about this in my column this past week in the Finger Lakes Times. So Governor Cuomo made a Me Too joke during a little scrabble with press, an impromptu gaggle. It wasn't anything formal, but he made a Me Too joke. And the next day, he went on a radio show in New York City, and he doubled down on it. And he basically said, made excuses for it. He didn't apologize for it. There wasn't anything. He just whatever. That, to me, creates this scenario where you're saying it's okay for some and not okay for others. Or there's this appearance of, and when it comes to race in these communities, where you are looking at actual disparity between how one group is treated versus another, to introduce a new version of disparity in terms of how some folks are treated for their actions versus others, I think it showcases how much of an issue this is and how behind the 8 ball we are across the board.
Well, and we are, and that's why I think I'd like to see cooler heads prevail. In the case of Jeremy Capel, he was never given an opportunity to go on and apologize because he was removed from his job a couple of days later and told to say nothing about it. I think he's been a little too active for my taste, a little too out there defending himself. And I mean, maybe that's easy for me to say. I still have a job. But, he's got his supporters and he's on this media and that media. And to this day, I don't know that he's ever said, geez, I'm really sorry this came out of my mouth. I'm not a racist. I revere Dr. King and what he did.
So he posted that video, that first lengthy video to Facebook, which was the apology. He and his wife were sitting next to each other, kind of an awkward presentation of that whole. It was just something that was thrown together. Some people said it was genuine. Some people said it wasn't. That to me is kind of a separate debate. But it's just this. When we're reacting this fast, when we're moving at this speed, and we're allowing social media, and I don't want to call what's on social media untrue or contribute to that sort of thought process of fake news circulating online, but when you're talking about not allowing sort of a very matter-of-fact accumulation of data be the driver of the discussion, I think you're in a bad place. Also, I just want to quickly say, there has been a whole lot of discussion about cultural competency training. The mayor in Rochester made the assertion that media needed this training. As I've sort of looked into and tried to figure out what exactly that means, no one really seems to have a clear idea what that is. Everybody has a different definition of what that is. And if we're going to start talking about, and this is a critique of sort of how the progressive movements play out in real time, you need a pretty darn good plan on how you're going to handle these various issues. And I think there needs to, if you're going to say that a group of people need to be trained or educated, I think you have to make it very clear what the parameters are of that education and what the parameters are of that of the expectation. That way there you can actually move people. It's a lot easier to herd people when there's an end in sight or when there's a goal in sight. There isn't a goal in sight. There's just this ever fluctuating and ever moving goalpost of what the expectation is or what the standard is. And when we see things like this play out where one person's fired, another person isn't, and everything in between is gray, it's just going to be more questions.
Well, you said the key word a moment ago, which is the speed. We have no room left in our discourse for measured thought and reaction. And I mean, what I called for when I heard about the Jerry B. Capel story is basically what the St. Louis TV management did. It's like, okay, we all have a social media trail that we carry. If I did this slip of the tongue, you could go back through my last 8 years of Facebook and see my words condemning racism and supporting equal rights, and you would see nothing that smacked of racism. I would hope that would be used to judge me and say, okay, everything in this background says that he's telling the truth, that it was just a slip of the tongue. If you see stuff in my background that leads you to believe that really I am a racist and it wasn't a slip of the tongue, okay. But it moves too fast, so everything we have to have instant reaction, and if we don't react instantly, someone in my profession will call up and try to get you to, and what do you think? Reaction. I mean, that's half of what we have in our media now is reaction. And I think just in terms of the overall issue of racism and do we need cultural sensitivity training, maybe we do. I don't know. Maybe we say things that we don't even think are offensive to the black community that are. But I've said a number of times, I think that what I see as phony incidents of racism are frequently brought up, and I think they hurt the cause of fighting the real racism that's out there. I think that I can't speak for anybody in the black community. If my people had been owned as property 150 years ago, I might not be happy with the speed of change. But I think you have to battle real racism. You can't invent phony incidents of it to try to advance your cause. I think ultimately that hurts your cause.
Yeah. So one time, I know we mentioned it at the top of the hour, where can folks hear you throughout the week? Finger Lakes Morning News.
Finger Lakes Morning News is on 1240 AM, 95.9 FM, WGVA in Geneva, and on 98.1 FM and 1590 AM, WAUB in Auburn, and at various high school gyms and hockey rinks throughout the area.
And tonight and tomorrow you will be doing basketball and hockey?
Tonight I have Geneva Panthers basketball on WGVA at 7:30, and I will be doing the William Smith and Hobart basketball tomorrow at 2 and 4, and then beating a very hasty retreat home in front of the storm, I hope.
All right. Well, thanks for coming in. That is all the time we have for today. Appreciate everyone tuning in live. If you're watching us on YouTube, like and subscribe to the FO1 channel. If you're listening to the podcast on iTunes or on the TuneIn app, like more than 30,000 have this past fall, be sure to rate and review the Debrief. We will be back next week. Until then, stay warm, stay safe, and don't get snowed in, I guess. See ya.